Okay, I'm live on YouTube. It's the first time I've been live on YouTube. First time I've been on live on YouTube on my channel. Let me just clarify that. It's a little more challenging than Facebook because people use Facebook all the time and people tend to go to YouTube for specific things. So it's harder to attract viewers on YouTube than it is on Facebook. But that will be one of my topics tonight, to talk about the censorship that I'm undergoing and the article that I wrote. Got my new top. I was talking about this the other day. So it's hard to find really super blingy black tops. Maybe my opponents will be able to ascertain a little better that it's not the same top every time. So I'll just loiter for a bit here and then I'll get going on the subject at hand, which is censorship, and this article that I've written that's generated a little bit of attention. And it's hard to get attention when you've been censored by almost every major means of communication. I never really worked YouTube that much, so I haven't really built up much of an audience on YouTube. I might have to look at doing that in the short term anyway. So let's just see if I can bring this in so we can see what I'm talking about here. Just shrink this a bit. Yep, hang on. Okay, so there we go. This is the article that I wrote. I slapped together some artwork for it. I borrowed some art from other places and then patched them together to try to capture a mood. People might find the use of this is artwork that was used for a Pink Floyd album back in the late 80s, I believe it was. I've adapted that and modified it for the topic at hand. Like I say, some people might be curious as to why. What's with the hospital beds? And by the ocean? Well, there's a whole sort of story there, but the hospital beds has to do with the opening quote of my article. But we'll leave that for a moment. I'm supposed to be doing Freedom Free for All tomorrow night, so I'm going to talk about some stuff on there too, on one of their unscheduled or irregular episodes. The censorship that I'm undergoing right now is, to put it mildly, frustrating, because they've virtually turned me off completely. I'm here on YouTube trying to keep some sort of stream of communication going, but my Twitter account has been totally killed. My Facebook account is suspended now for 30 days. Actually, I had a backup account, so both accounts are suspended until next month. So there's been a real sort of war against me. And let me just see. I think I've got what I got suspended for. This is actually kind of interesting. Yeah, I'll show you what it was. Hang on. Okay, so this was the original suspension that I got on Facebook. Okay, now I don't know if you can read that. Let's see, it's a little bigger. Bullying, harassment and bullying. They deemed this to be harassment and bullying, which is basically an announcement that I was going to be doing a Facebook live stream, and I was going to be talking about Hope Warren, who, kind of like me to a lesser degree, is a political activist, and he was outside my talk. Hi, Justy Dame. So yeah, this guy, Hope Warren, was outside my talk protesting and making all kinds of comments about me, like people like to do. It never ceases to amaze me how the love and inclusion crowd likes to just bury me nonstop in personal insults and ad hominem attacks, and trying to strip me of my identity and just sort of tear me apart completely. And then they have the gall to march around with love and inclusion flags and signs. So, but that's what they do. Anyway, so Hope Warren was outside my talk, and he, was saying false things about me, claiming I was saying things that I wasn't saying, these types of things. So I decided I would discuss some of the stuff that he was saying on a Facebook Live stream. And I announced that, and as you can see here, it was pretty benign. I just said I was going to do a broadcast. It was actually a rebroadcast of one I did before, actually. And just explaining what it was going to be. And then I included, there down at the bottom there, included a picture of Hope Warren from Hope Warren's Facebook page, right? And they deemed this to be harassment and bullying, and notified me that I was suspended for 30 days for it. 30 days for that. So I protested it, and I asked for a review. And they did a review, and then they determined that, we're actually going to have a hard time trying to convince anybody that this is bullying. So we're just going to admit that you were correct and that this wasn't harassment and bullying, and we're going to put your post back on and reinstate you. But then, after they did that, I got this message. Can you see that? So right after they reinstated my account, boom, I get this message right away. You can't post right now. You may have used Facebook in a way that our system considers unusual, even if you didn't mean to. You can post again in 30 days. So they retracted my 30-day suspension for harassment and bullying, and then just slammed me with a, the random 30-day suspension for unusual behavior of some sort. And apparently no obligation on their behalf to try to explain what that was. Of course, this is all coincidentally right at the time when I'm trying to push for a provincial and hopefully a national inquiry into what's happening with foster children and our most vulnerable children. So what may be one of the most important times in my activism in this struggle, Facebook has decided to totally silence me. So there's a sort of a wide sort of sweeping social media crackdown on people like me who are speaking the truth. And I sort of go out of my way to try to be as polite to people as possible and not to hurl vicious insults at them. You will never find me saying vicious things, for instance, about Morgane Auger, who's my sort of arch nemesis here. I don't insult Morgane's appearance or try to, demean Morgane as a human being. I do question Morgane's logic, but logical arguments are open. It's fair play, right? But I don't try to be mean to them. So, but it doesn't matter. So the slightest thing that I do now is an excuse for the social media companies to silence me. Now, people need to understand that hi, Jerry. Yeah, the New World Order. So what people need to understand is that, as Megan Murphy has said, that social media like Facebook and Twitter, these have become the new sort of town square. This is where people go to meet and discuss things. Facebook, I believe, has 19 million users in Canada, which represents something like 75% of the voting population. So if you're a political activist and politically involved, that's where you go. Okay, so all of my opponents in British Columbia and Canada and elsewhere, I've got opponents all over the globe now, they all go to Facebook and they sort of, that's where they, chant their chants, and that's where they sort of try to spread their message and attack me. Okay, so they are able to use this as a platform to promote their political agendas, right? So I am on the other side of the coin, and I'm coming in with a contrary argument. Okay, but I've been silenced. Okay, I've been totally silenced. So they are able, and they are right now. I mean, as I do this broadcast, there's probably people on my Facebook saying defamatory things about me and tearing apart my argument, and I can't reply, right? So that, in my opinion, is egregious political interference by Facebook. They wouldn't have this problem if they didn't have their ridiculous policies. Facebook says, well, we have to sort of decide what we're going to allow people to post and what we're not going to allow people to post, and it's a difficult situation for us. All this blah, 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 blah stuff. They don't have to worry about that. There are laws in place in every jurisdiction in the world regarding what people can and cannot say in terms of freedom of speech. So you can't go on and utter death threats about people, for instance, right? But Facebook doesn't really have to police that, right? That is covered by law enforcement, right? You just report it to law enforcement, and law enforcement can deal with it, right? So Facebook doesn't even have to police extreme things like that, let alone things like me saying that a man can't be a woman, right? They don't need to get involved in that. Now, if somebody, and I found this interesting because I was watching Twitter executive being interviewed on the Joe Rogan show. And no, I'm not a Joe Rogan fan. I won't get into that right now. But Joe Rogan was on there with some other guy who's supposed to be critical. And they interviewed I forget the guy's name who runs Twitter or founded Twitter, and sort of his chief, one of his chief executives who's in charge of legal issues and stuff was on there with him. And they talked for 3 hours about censorship issues on Twitter. And they went almost the entire 3 hours without barely mentioning the word block. Okay, they gave endless justifications and used endless examples of what is censored, why it's censored, why they suspend people, why they kick people off, on and on and on and on and on and on. And they just did not mention the word block. Okay, if somebody doesn't like what I'm saying on social media, there is a feature called block. They can push that block and they will never have to see my words on the screen again. I use it all the time. I have an enormous block list. I get people who come on and their whole sort of reason for existing is to bury me in nonstop insults and, demean me in every possible way. And that's all they ever do when they come onto my Facebook, is just demean everything about me. So rather than put up with these people, I go block, and phew, they're gone. I never have to see them or deal with them again, unless they come back using a different identity. But that's a separate issue, okay? But that's not what I do, okay? So I don't say I'm having a discussion with Morgane Auger, and Morgane Auger blocks me because Morgane doesn't like what I'm saying or something. I won't create a new identity called, say, Genzilla, and then go back at Morgane and keep saying the same thing. That is a kind of harassment, and you might be able to understand something like that. But that's not what I do, right? I very seldom will comment on any of Morgane Auger's threads at all, unless somebody points me to one for some particular reason. But for the most part, I won't go out. But if I do, and Morgane doesn't like what I'm saying, he can block me. And sometimes he puts me in what he calls timeouts and stuff too. And that's fine, right? And I won't go back and harass him though. But that is the beauty of the block feature. So the fact that these social media companies and their executives will talk on and on and on about why they have to permanently ban people like me or ban me for 30 days and stuff, but never mention the word block, is sort of should be an indicator to you that these people aren't being entirely honest. Okay, they want that feature because they want to be able to control the narrative. So on this transgender narrative in British Columbia, they have determined what will be discussed in this marketplace of ideas called Facebook, where there are 19 million Canadians. And they have decided that I will not have a voice for 30 days and have actually warned me that my account is in a status where it might be permanently disabled, just like I was permanently suspended from Twitter. I don't know who Jack Dorsey is, Jerry. This sort of opens up another subject, though. Okay, so this is another thing that people need to consider. Let me just catch up on the comments here. Oh, yes, I remember you there in Rhode Island. Yes, I remember you well. Hi, how are you? So Jack Dorsey. Jack Dorsey. I don't know who Jack Dorsey is. What I will say is that look at people like, say, Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson is a potty mouth, okay? Jordan Peterson swears and is insulting all the time. Yet Jordan Peterson doesn't get suspended, right? There are others like Jordan Peterson who don't have the same sort of name as Jordan Peterson who will say controversial things and not get suspended. I would pay close attention to who gets suspended and who doesn't on our side of the argument. And I believe that that is going to tell you something about that person. So I believe that Jordan Peterson is sort of part of the problem and not part of the solution. So he's allowed to speak. But you don't have to sort of reduce it to that kind of understanding. All you need to do is understand that as long as you are criticizing the right or criticizing the left, for the most part, you're going to be okay. Okay, it's when you, well, I mean, if you cross certain lines, sure. But people like me who say, forget right and left, okay, the whole system is rotten, okay, because I believe that you don't have a right and a left. What you have is a right establishment and a left establishment. Okay, but the uniting factor between those two is the word establishment, which sits above them, okay, and controls both of them, okay, because ultimately they're on the same page, okay. So there are certain narratives that will be discussed, and you will not see it being adequately addressed by either side of the spectrum, which will give you your clue that our media is under control. I'm not going to break that down now. I could, but I'm not going to. Point is, it's under control, and there are certain figures who are allowed to speak and who are allowed to be critics. So we now have heroes coming in, for instance, on our side of the debate, such as Ken Zucker. Ken Zucker is being presented as this radical hero on our side of the equation who's out there defending children bravely, right? Well, Ken Zucker is a former member of WPATH, okay, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. And he helped come up with these crazy guidelines that are being used to transition all of these kids. And he has, so he was part of this pharmaceutical complex manufactured nightmare that is now destroying so many children. But now he rolls in and suddenly identifies himself as a hero of children. Let me actually just bring something up here, since we're on the subject of Zucker. Just bear with me, so I want to show you something. Okay, so Ken Zucker. So comes in, says, I'm a hero. I'm opposed to child transition. Okay, when you listen to Ken Zucker talk, it all sounds great from people on our side of the fence. Oh, great, he's on our side. Finally, some qualified professional who's on our side of the debate, right? Sounds great. He's opposed to child transition. But what you won't hear him say in his talks is that he defines child differently than most people define. At least most people looking at this debate. So most of the mothers and parents that I've talked to who are concerned about this in this debate will talk about Ken Zucker and how Zucker is on their side. And meanwhile, they're parents of teenagers. And I'm thinking, okay, well, are you aware that Ken Zucker actually is 100% for your teenager transitioning? And they were like, no, he says he's against child transitioning. And that's because they're speaking a different language than Zucker. So let's take a look here. I'll show you what I mean. Got some fireworks going outside. It's Halloween weekend. Okay, so make this a little bigger. So down there on the here, this is a quote from an article done on Ken Zucker, noting that Ken Zucker has transitioned many kids. And he was asked about his feelings towards transitioning. And right there he said, by age 11 or 12, trans kids are typically locked into their gender identity. And for them, I very much support that pathway being medical transition. So Ken Zucker actually is, my chair over. Ken Zucker is actually for transitioning anybody over the age of 11, basically. So when he's out there telling everybody he's opposed to child transition, most people think that means, basically any youth who's going to school from, primary to middle to high school, right? That's what most people think when he's saying I'm opposed to child transition. But he never breaks that down. He never defines that. He never lets people know when he says child, he means under the age of 12, okay? And what that really means, and when you look at what Zucker has said elsewhere, what that really means is that he is a proponent of the vast majority of youth transitions. Because if we look at the other thing there, as big as that graph here, this graph basically is showing you who is transition. Oh, it's boys in blue and girls in red. This graph was designed to illustrate how who's identifying as transgender sort of reverses as they get older. So when they're younger, it tends to be more boys, but by the time you get into the teens, it tends to be more females, as you can see here. But what you can see in this graph here is, if I draw a square around it there, is that the vast majority of youth transitions are 12 and over. Okay, the vast majority. So when Ken Zucker comes along and says he opposes this group here, he's not really opposing much. Okay, that would be, and that is what I would call the perfect big pharmaceutical company fallback position. Okay, they would love to transition them all, right? That would be great from their perspective, but you have to be realistic in the business world. You have to assume that, okay, this is a politically loaded, sensitive topic. There's probably going to be some pushback. So what is going to be our fallback position? What is our plan B? What is something that we can live with? Well, they can live with, in my opinion, this group over here. Okay, they can live with that because that's where the vast majority of their profits are, right? Even at 12, they can still be giving them Lupron, which sells for about $400 per month. So Zucker isn't a hero. He's what I call a faux hero. But he's allowed to speak for the most part. Ray Blanchard falls into the same category. He's on Twitter. He hasn't been suspended from Twitter. There was a big fuss, and it was all over the newspapers and stuff when Ray Blanchard was suspended for a day. And then his account was reinstated for saying some reasonably innocuous thing about transgender people. Meanwhile, I, as a transgender person, was permanently suspended, and nobody said a word about it. Okay, I let all of the media know about it. Okay, all of the alternative media, Rebel Media, Post Millennial, all of these different media outlets, I let know about it. Nobody reported on it, but they reported on the Blanchard one-day suspension, and went crazy with that. And that's because they're giving. Just like Zucker, they're giving an approved narrative. Okay, and that approved narrative, actually in Zucker's case, it's not even spoken, is it? Right? He's just sort of pretending to be this hero. And what people are going to find out later is that once they've adopted him as their official expert spokesperson, is that the vast majority of transitions are just going to continue. But if Zucker is given some sort of status as, helping with regulations or whatever, it'll be perceived as a victory, but it really won't be a victory. But you see this with other people too. So also in that quote, we can see somebody else who came out recently as a hero for our side, and that's Camille Paglia. I believe that's how you pronounce it, which is interesting. And she's kind of saying the same thing. So let's take a look at what she said there. So she talks about it being sort of a crime against humanity to be transitioning these kids. But once again, she's using that Zucker definition of kids. So a child doesn't know his or her future identity at age 3 or 10 for that matter. Okay. But once you get to 11 and stuff, this is when all these, what I call fake heroes, suddenly start getting a little wishy-washy. Okay. So, and it's not a coincidence that Paglia says, even age 10. Okay, she's not going to talk about teens because they want to keep on transitioning teens. Meanwhile, Paglia's billed all over alternative media as this hero expert intellectual who's coming out on our side of the debate. She also happens to be pro-pedophilia too. And that is another theme that I've noticed with people on our side of the debate tend to be pro-pedophile. So I'm getting silenced because when I talk about some child transition, what I really mean is school-age kids, right? Before the age of majority, before they take over their own lives, while they're still under the guardianship of their parents. That's what I mean when I talk about children. And I'm always clarifying that for people. I'm always clarifying for people when they're, pointing to people like Zucker. I say, okay, you can talk about Zucker, but let's be clear about who Zucker is and what he stands for and what he doesn't stand for, right? And they can't have me doing that. So they are just anxious to keep me as silent as possible, as much as possible. And there are other people who are the approved opposition, and that would be Zucker, that would be Oren Amate, that would be Camille Paglia, that would be a whole host of people, but they're all sort of on the same page for the most part. Let me just see if I can catch up on the comments here. The James Younger case, is that the one in Texas? That's the one in Texas, right, with the 7-year-old? That one's a no-brainer. Okay, so again, we have to be careful here. Okay, so we see that the Attorney General in Texas has said that this should be investigated, this case where the 7-year-old boy is being transitioned to a girl. Okay, now for me, that's a no-brainer. You don't do that with a child. Okay, a child is in no position to understand their true identity. Okay, how many people as adults, let's say once you get into your 30s, all these 20-year-olds think that they're adults, they're babies, right? They're still babies. They haven't figured out their identity for the most part. Let's say once you get into your 30s and stuff, How many people can say, okay, well, I'm the same as I was when I was 16, let alone 7, right? Of course you don't know your identity. And the last thing you want to be doing is anything that is going to make permanent changes to a child that they can't come back from, right? So that is a no-brainer. But we need to be careful here again, because again, we've got this definition of child. Everybody needs to be clarifying. Whenever you hear somebody saying they're opposed to child transition, how do you define child, right? Get that out of them every time so you're clear, right? So in this case, you may get this sort of paraded in front of you as a victory, right? And they might change some guidelines to say under a certain age can't get this, that, or the next thing, or you can't do this or that. But remember that the vast majority of transitions are 12 and up. Okay, these are the ones whose lives are really being destroyed. Okay, the vast majority. That is something that we need to focus on. And I don't care what anybody says. When you're a teenager, you don't know, who you are and what you're going to be in 10, 20 years down the road. Okay, so we should not be allowing them to make these permanent changes either. We don't allow them to drink alcohol, right? So why would we be allowing them to make permanent changes to their bodies? Okay, we put limitations on them for their own good. So that's what we need to be careful with. Dorsey, yeah, Dorsey was the Twitter guy. Yeah, you're right. That was Jerry was saying. Co-founders of Twitter, yeah. So what do I think of the case in Texas? I just said. Oh, hi, Barrett. Barrett is somebody who showed some internal fortitude and willingness to stand up for free speech. I don't think when Barrett hosted me, he particularly understood at that time the full scope of the free speech problems that I'm having. Okay, so it's kind of easy to see, when you get a mob outside the building protesting, okay, well, that's one thing, and it's difficult to rent venues and stuff, but it's way beyond that with me, right? So when you look again at what I was censored for on Twitter, just go back to that. Just go back, hang on. There it is. So this is what I was censored for on Twitter, right? It was just an announcement of, that I was going to be doing a redo of a video I did on Hope Warren, right? And I included a picture of Hope Warren from Hope Warren's Facebook, right? Saying, or describing him as the consummate weirdo. And one has to keep in mind that Hope owns that title, right? He deliberately tries to be weird. That's his whole shtick, right? So that's a nothing statement. And yet they banned me for 30 days for that. And I, of course, put in a request for a review. And they did a review, and they said, yeah, you're right. That's really was a lame excuse for having you banned for 30 days. So they put my post back online. And then they reinstated my account. And then within minutes almost, I got this message. You may have used Facebook in a way that our system considers unusual, even if you didn't mean to. You can post again in 30 days. So immediately after revoking the one 30-day ban, they slapped me with this other 30-day mystery ban. Okay, and all of this right at the time when I'm trying to push for a government inquiry. Okay, this is political espionage by Facebook. They are deliberately intervening and interfering in the political processes of this province. I was born here. I was raised here. I have a right to go out and try to influence and affect our government in terms of policy and stuff and try to move towards political action. I have a right to do that. Facebook, as a foreign entity, has no right to come in and tamper with our political processes. Okay, so they are providing a platform for the opposition to spew their stuff, right? Their reality denying nonsense, which I believe is destroying young, vulnerable kids. And then when I come in and try to offer a counter narrative, they silence me. Okay, they are deciding that debate. And if they get a single nickel from the drug companies, they should all be dragged into jail. That is my feeling. And by the way, this is what happened. This other screen here. I tried to protest the mystery ban, and I wrote an exclamation, and this is what happened. So we can't process your request. So they wouldn't let me complain about the subsequent ban. So that's what I'm facing. And I don't think when Barrett decided to host me there, he understood the full scope of what I'm facing in terms of censorship. I mean, right now, other than YouTube, where I've got like 7 viewers, I've been pretty much totally silenced. Okay, so I went from having tens of thousands of people reading my Synanon essay and being, fairly well circulated in the community to now being virtually completely silent. Okay, I can't communicate almost on any channel, right? Public venues in big cities won't rent to me. Newspapers won't publish my ads. Twitter suspended me permanently. Facebook is constantly suspending me. I'm, being essentially totally silenced. And this is, to call it insidious doesn't quite capture it, in my opinion. We have very bad things happening in our society today. TV Computer says you support free speech. That's good. Everybody should support free speech, okay? Because if you support me being silenced today, you support you being silenced tomorrow. That's the way it works, okay? Unless, of course, you think that everything that you think and believe about the political system and our establishment is always going to be in alignment with the establishment and always in alignment with the majority, well, then you might be okay. But sooner or later, you're going to have some idea or powerful belief that goes against the establishment. That's when you face being censored, just like me. So Barrett's hoping to host me again. And maybe I'm looking at taking another bit of time off of work in late November because I can't let these people win and silence me. So we'll see. It says we need legal representation. Yeah, legal representation. Unfortunately, we don't have much in the way of defenders of free speech in Canada at all. Our politicians, for the most part, don't support it. Across the board, okay, whether you're talking far left or far right, everybody across the board is opposed to free speech. They all say that they support free speech, but when push comes to shove, they're all supporting, for instance, this new digital charter and all of these censorship guidelines that they're trying to implement online now to control people like me, right? All of them, every single one, okay? So whether you're talking Trudeau and Singh, or whether you're talking about Scheer and Bernier, all of them support censorship, okay? And that's because they're all part of the same freaking establishment, okay? And as far as sort of independent defenders of free speech, okay, I am like what I would call a canary in the coal mine of free speech in British Columbia, okay? So Trinity Western University, Camosun College, the University of Victoria, Douglas College, all of these institutions of higher learning that are supposed to be champions of free speech refused to allow me to speak on their campus. In 2 cases, I had contracts that were canceled, preventing me from speaking, but they all had subclauses saying, oh, we can cancel for any reason at any time, right? So that was their way out, so of any sort of legal problems. Or in the case of Douglas College, particularly when I put in my second submission to speak there, they just refused to give me a reason, right? They just said, no, we're not going to let you speak. And I say, okay, well, why not? What's your reason? We're just not going to let you speak. Period. End of story, right? So that's a way of getting around or trying to get around legal ramifications, but we all know why they're not letting me speak. So I had these 4 institutions cancel me, and it got a fair amount of media coverage. Of course, it was all talking about me as a hateful bigot, right? So they were justifying the decision of these institutions and, you know, patting them on the back for doing the right thing. But it was widely reported. And that was all before UBC. And actually, that was all after Oak Bay, which was why Oak Bay was not more widely covered is a real mystery to me. Okay, you see what happened with when Jordan Peterson was still a nobody. Okay, when nobody pretty much knew who Jordan Peterson was. He had this little incident outside the University of Toronto where he got into a jousting match with a bunch of transgender kids. And you can see the video of this reasonably small crowd, and Jordan Peterson strutting around like a rooster with his chest sticking out, yelling at these kids, right? And that got coverage all over Canada, all over the world, went viral. This launched Jordan Peterson to superstardom, right? That this brave champion of free speech was standing up to these kids, right? Meanwhile, you look at what happened to me in Oak Bay, right? This massive mob. There was over 400 people confirmed that they actually went. Between those who are outside and those who are inside, it may have been 450 people there who came out to protest my event. And you look at the madness that went inside the room, and we've got like tons of dramatic video footage of what transpired. And this video footage and stuff was all sent out to all of the major media outlets, to all the alternative media outlets. And other than a watered down version I saw in a couple of publications in Victoria, it was not covered at all. Okay, it wasn't covered at all. And this is back to my thing about, you know, they will cover certain people and certain things, but they won't cover other things because certain people and certain things support a narrative, or they support what I call the fallback narrative. Okay, because most of these government initiatives are designed within a legal framework, which is to say that you always are going to ask for more than you actually want, right? So hence my talking about Ken Zucker being a fallback guy, because his fallback position is actually something big pharmaceutical companies could live with, right? Because they still get the majority of their profits off of this thing. So, but the Oak Bay thing didn't get covered. And then there were these 4 other institutions that refused to host me. Those got covered in the media. It was talked about in the media. And then, of course, there was the big UBC fiasco, which was, you know, probably hundreds of articles written about that. Radio shows were talking about it. It was talked about on TV and all this stuff. We had 5,000 employees at UBC demanding that I not be allowed to speak. So where were our free speech institutions? Okay, so we have BC Civil Liberties. Okay, as far as I can tell, the BC Civil Liberties organization is a bunch of useless eaters. All they do is sit around and dine and collect money. They don't do anything productive, as far as I can tell. They've never done a damn thing for me when I was basically, I would argue, the most censored person in British Columbia. I would say that I still am, right? And it was on the news, and it was easy for them to observe, right? They had nothing to say, right? Not a word to say about me, okay? The Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms sent a letter to UBC after UBC announced that they were going to let me speak, saying, well, congratulations. And then for some strange reason, the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms listed my case at UBC as being one of their official cases. They said, Jen Smith versus UBC, and then they described the case there and how UBC backed down and allowed me to speak. But they presented it as if it was one of their cases and one of their victories, when it was nothing of the sort, right? But, you know, what have they done for me? What have they really done for me? Nothing, right? Nothing. I tried to get them interested in what happened at Oak Bay, but they don't seem to think there's anything there, right? The fact that it was a police stand down and chaos was essentially allowed to break out there, it just doesn't seem to be of any interest to them. And that's because, as far as I can tell, our free speech organizations have the same problems that all of our other organizations in society have, which are establishment biases. Okay, so right establishment or left establishment. Okay, if you're somebody like me who criticizes the establishment, okay, persona non grata, out, can't have you talking, right? And also because I go after the pharmaceutical industries. I'm the only person who aggressively goes after the pharmaceutical industry right now. Meghan Murphy gets a lot of coverage, right? A lot of hoopla is raised about Meghan Murphy. Meghan Murphy doesn't really say much controversial other than that men aren't women. And that's not that controversial. Meghan Murphy does not go after the pharmaceutical industry. Meghan Murphy does not go after Soji 123, right? So the JCCF and well, there's really nobody else will represents you know, somebody who's within the officially allowed opposition narrative, but has very little interest in getting involved with me. So legal representation. Most lawyers don't want anything to do with it. I contacted one lawyer who agreed that they would have something to do with it, but then he said they won't do it so pro bono or on a percentage basis, and that a significant retainer would be needed. So I said, okay, well, how much of a retainer? And they sent an estimate for the legal bill, which was $200,000. And I said, okay, well, guess no justice for me. Thanks. So, yeah, so much for getting legal representation. Legal representation is for the wealthy, pretty much, period. And for people who have nothing but time. I mean, I could probably investigate doing it myself, and I have been going down that road, but, you know, the media is not covering me, honestly. I'm being silenced on every platform. My options are really kind of limited. Ah, yes. Yeah, that. First they came for who? First they came for the socialist, but I wasn't a socialist, right? The socialists. You got a lot of people saying the Nazis were socialists now because that's in their name. They weren't socialists they were fascist, right? There was a merger of corporate state power there. That's what they were. They weren't socialists in any meaningful sense. George Orwell was a socialist, right? So let's take a look at this article that I wrote today that generated a lot of discussion within a very small group because I have very limited abilities to communicate right now, and diminishing by the day. Let's take a look. It's here somewhere. Oh, there it is. Breaking the sorcerer's spell. Bhakti as the physician in a world of censorship and induced madness. So what's that all about, right? People need to understand, first of all, that the words dharma and bhakti are interpreted by me differently than some other people might interpret them. So I had somebody go after me about my interpretation of the word dharma. Although if you look at dictionary definitions of dharma and stuff, one of the first things they make clear is that there's no one single definition of dharma. Okay. So as Voltaire said, when entering a debate, you need to define your terms. So for me, we are living under basically the real world equivalent of what was in the TV series Lost, Project Dharma, right? And to me, Dharma is Jordan Peterson. Okay, Jordan Peterson is about this natural order and natural hierarchy, and there are, everybody needs to know their place, right? And if you're a lowly incel, you need to know that that's your place as an incel, and don't you dare question the establishment where your natural superiors are, right? That's Dharma, order, hierarchy, and control. Okay, that is what the people at the top of our society are all about. I have said that I'm driven by bhakti. Now, bhakti is another East Indian concept. The way I interpret that is a supreme devotion to a higher power or a higher purpose in life. Okay, that's what I'm about. Okay, so that's why I put that in the title, Breaking the Sorcerer's Spell. Bhakti as the physician, so supreme devotion in a world of censorship and induced madness. And I say induced madness because I believe much of the craziness that we see going on in society today is deliberately induced. It's not by accident, okay? And I've addressed this in other areas that I believe that there is a, not only like our mainstream media has been under control almost entirely now for a long time, but I think it's gone beyond that now. And now the media and these other instruments of communication that are under control by the establishment are being used as mass mind manipulation tools. Okay, so if we have a lot of craziness going on in society today, right, I won't break down all of the craziness, but the whole transgender thing of boy being a girl is part of that. This is induced. Okay, so induced madness. So let's go into the article here. I started it off. This article actually was inspired by an email that I wrote to a friend who was commenting on the fact that I had been almost completely silenced and censored. And I guess her concern was to just tell me to buck up and be strong and to remember that that I myself as a person am important, because I tend to have seen this, and I've told people before that this is more like what I'm doing, I believe is more important than me. I believe it's more important than my life. Because of the damage that it's causing. So knowing that about me, I think she felt the need to just tell me to, keep a stiff upper lip and remember that I matter. And because I think she knows that I've battled with depression issues throughout my whole life, really. So I guess that was it. But I thought I would start with a quote from my favorite fictional author. And what he is he's actually a philosophical science fiction writer, Philip K. Dick. Okay, he wrote this book, which is my favorite fiction book, Valis. The first time I read this book, I was like, okay, the main character in this book, which was loosely modeled on Philip K. Dick himself, and it's like a fictionalized autobiography, or from a portion of his life anyway. So he's taken his real life and he's fictionalized it with all of these other characters. But it's about like sort of the split personality and stuff. And when I read this book and, read the character in the book, it was like, okay, so this could have been written about me. I mean, this is like the way my brain functions, right? This sort of split personality, extreme introvert, autodidactic, all the books and stuff. Somebody obsessively self-educated and highly superstitious and mystically inclined. That was me, and that's what Valis was all about. And I've read this book probably a dozen times. But this introduced me to Philip K. Dick, and I became sort of, what they now call a dickhead. But that's like a pun, right? But a big fan. So I got into his philosophical writings, and I recently went out and I got this book. Can you see that? The Exegesis of Philip K. Dick. It's this big, thick book. It's 900 pages. I've read it through twice. And I've got his collected works and other stuff there too. So I'm a big Philip K. Dick fan. And I decided to use a quote from him again. I used a quote from Philip K. Dick in my Synanon essay, which is now probably sliding towards 100,000 views. Must be one of the best read essays on the subject of transgenderism out there, really. Particularly of the ones that weren't published. Right? This was self-published on my blog and was never published on like in the mainstream, like not in the Federalist, not in the Daily Wire or anything like that. I self-published it, and it still has become almost like a cult classic. But I used the Philip K. Dick quote to start that essay, and this one I decided to use a Philip K. Dick quote too. To understand why I included that quote, it's because, again, Philip K. Dick and I, in some ways, I don't want to sort of compare myself in importance to certainly to Philip K. Dick, but our minds kind of operate the same way. Okay, we're both very superstitious, and we both believe in God and have unusual views on the universe, and are always trying to sort of understand things and make sense of things. And I remembered something that Philip K. Dick had written, and it sort of addresses me and my mental state. So let's take a look at that. Just read it for you. From loss and grief, the mind has become deranged. Therefore, we, as parts of the universe, the brain, are partly deranged. Out of itself, the brain has constructed a physician to heal it. This subform of the macrobrain is not deranged. It moves through the brain, as a phagocyte moves through the cardiovascular system of an animal, healing the derangement of the brain in section after section. We know of its arrival here. We know it as Asclepios for the Greeks, and as the Essenes for the Jews, and as the Therapeutai of the Egyptians, and as Jesus for the Christians. To be born again, or born from above, or born of the Spirit, means to become healed, which is to say, restored to sanity. So it seems like a bit of an obscure quote, but it's actually not that obscure in the sense that it was like cosmically correct. Okay, I didn't plan it that way, and Barrett didn't plan it that way. But when I did my first official public call for an inquiry into what's happening with foster children and our most vulnerable children, it just worked out that it was on World Mental Health Day, right? And of course, this is a big part of my public presentations, and it's a big part of my concern with these kids and stuff, that mental health issues are enormous. And I use myself as a model in that because I have battled with what would be called mental health issues, so depression and self-image problems and these types of things. And I try to sort of unpack that and get to the importance of that in this whole transgender debate. And so when I'm being sort of censored for trying to do that in earnest and in sincerity, it's, of course, is sort of very depressing, not just frustrating, but very depressing to me. And so I sort of fall back into these, okay, so I've got to find some way to get my brain back on track. So that's why I opened with that quote. Before I go on, I'll try to catch up on comments. Yeah, 11. Well, down to 9 people now. But I mean, that's part of the problem. One of the things with like I don't usually use YouTube. I never worked YouTube. I think I've got like 900 subscribers or something, but I haven't really actively worked the YouTube platform. So most people won't come here looking for me. They'll go to Facebook. Maybe there's still a few who go to Twitter. I don't know, but certainly people go to Facebook, but they won't find me there for a month. And a lot of them won't know to look for me on YouTube. So it's just whoever sort of stumbles into the room or may have gotten word that I was going to be broadcasting here. We're going to show up here. Bojangles is a fellow dickhead. I'm a massive Philip K. Dick fan. Again, my favorite book ever, period. The first one. It's like part of a trilogy, actually, but this is by far the best one. So I don't expect many people to be watching tonight. I'm going to be doing a broadcast with Adam Blaney of Freedom Free for All tomorrow night on his Freedom Free for All stream, which has more people, and they expect, like they go there specifically looking. So we'll get probably more coverage over there. But tonight I'm just sort of going over some stuff randomly. Let's go back to our article in question. So yeah, I'm just talking about how the censorship has been affecting me, and the ways in which they're affecting me, and the fact that I regard Facebook's actions as a kind of political espionage, okay? Deliberately interfering in the processes of British Columbia. Here I have been actively trying to affect government policy, bring things to the attention of my fellow citizens, and Facebook has deliberately, as an outsider, intervened in that process and is siding with one side of this political debate. That is political espionage. In my opinion, it is political espionage. And, as I said, if it can be found that the pharmaceutical industry gives Facebook any money, they should be up on criminal charges. Okay? Because by silencing me, they are favoring the pharmaceutical industry. Okay? And I regard that as criminal interference. Well, I'm glad you're able to find somebody there, Barrett. I was not able to find anybody, so you're ahead of me. Of course, you probably got better connections than me. That's good. Okay, back to the article in question. Yeah, and I note there is that this part here, can you see that? Sure it's highlighting. Yeah, so if you look at the highlighted part there, the alternative media ignores me. So why is the alternative media ignoring me? Okay, that I would be because I believe the alternative media is just as controlled as the mainstream media. So the post-millennial, I guess before they got to figure out who I was, allowed me to start writing for them. And I wrote a couple of articles for them within the last year on the whole transgender issue that were widely, well received and got good circulation. I look at some of the articles that Lindsay Shepard has published for them, for instance, and mine were, for the most part, much more popular. I broke the story about the father who's being forced to facilitate his daughter's transitioned to a boy and the testosterone injections, I broke that story with the post-millennial nationally, and that got an awful lot of views. But still, apparently the post-millennial won't. So I've tried to submit other articles to the post-millennial. For instance, I wrote a piece on this issue of foster kids and stuff, right? And sort of laid it all out, and I submitted it to them to publish along with a couple of other articles, and they don't even respond to me anymore. Okay, not only did they not respond to me anymore, they deleted the articles I wrote for them. And if you go to the post-millennial, well, I'll show you what happens when you go to the post-millennial. Just give me a sec here. When you go to the post-millennial's website, do a search for Jen Smith. It used to bring up my articles. The only thing it'll bring up now is the following. Okay, it'll bring up the articles that I wrote for them, right? There they are. So the two articles, very well-read articles. But when you actually go to the articles and you click on them, this is what you get. So I was experiencing technical difficulties. As far as I can tell, it's just my articles that generate that. And it's been like that for a long time, despite the fact that many people have contacted them, tried to alert them to the problem, and asked them to put my stories back online, but they won't do it. Again, alternative media. And who writes for the post-millennial? Lindsay Shepard, the head of the JCCF, Jordan Peterson, Barbara Kay, all of these sort of right establishment people, or the official opposition. I am not the official opposition, so my stories have been flushed down the memory hole, and I don't exist as far as they're concerned. So beware of the alternative media. Okay, let's go back to that other article. Discuss some of the finer points. Full screen. There we go. So yeah, here's something that I talk about. So I talk about Zucker and a fallback narrative, right? But I also believe that there's something else going on that seems to be working out well for the establishment. So we've got all of these crazy leftists out there who are getting money from, like Soji123, I've pointed out, just got $200,000 from the Royal Bank. So it's a corporate world that is funding all of this, what people call leftist craziness. I mean, that isn't what leftists used to be. Okay, so I'm an old left-leaning libertarian. I'm an old Noam Chomsky disciple who believes in, strong social programs and stuff like this. I'm sort of old school left, and Noam Chomsky is an example of sort of old school left. Noam Chomsky is not the kind of guy who's going to, well, yeah, he's one of the great champions of free speech, actually. So he's not going to be out there demanding people be silenced and screaming that boys are actually girls and all of this crazy stuff. This is all new stuff, right? That is now being referred to as the left. And if you support the left, then you support these screaming, raving lunatics, and you support gulags and mass death camps and stuff. If you support social programs, you're the same thing as Joseph Stalin. So they get all of these crazy leftist loons out there screaming all this crazy leftist stuff. And then you get people like Jordan Peterson coming in going, aha, you see, these people are crazy. Well, I'm the champion of truth. And so we've got all of these people now, if they want truth and sanity, going over to the pro-corporate right establishment and all of their figures that support it, right? I'm going to break down all of the figures that are over there on the right. But we've got this mass sort of exodus. I mean, Trudeau just barely survived this election. Trump sort of surprise triumph in the state under the in the U.S. under the same sort of environment. So it's working out very well for the pro-establishment sorts. Whether you want to argue that that's by design or not is another question. So it's sort of a long discussion, but it gets frustrating to me because all these crazy lunatic leftists, to me, are not the left. They're these boogeymen, these irrational boogeymen that have been funded by the corporate world to scream about them being the champions of the left. And it works out well for the corporate world. So it's one of my frustrations that I deal with. And it's something that I can't get around because people just can't. So many people that I deal with are on the right, and they just can't imagine that they're heroes, right? Tucker Carlson, Joe Rogan, all of these, Jordan Peterson, they just can't imagine that their heroes are part of the establishment and part of the problem. And they just can't bring themselves to even contemplate the notion. It must just be, crazy Jen. And this led me to reference an old quote by C.S. Lewis, who said, "Their prison is in their minds, yet they are in that prison, and so afraid of being taken in that they cannot be taken out." So that's just another way of saying that, right? They just, they can't surrender their heroes, and they can't allow themselves to believe that they have been fooled by the establishment as well. Mark Twain, right? It was Mark Twain who said that it is easier to fool somebody than it is to convince them that they've been fooled, right? Same force at work here. And that was the same basic phenomena that paved the way for the rise of totalitarian fascism in Germany. Erich Fromm, who watched it there, observed this, and I've quoted it before, where he said one of the main things that allowed the totalitarian system to be set up in Germany was the fact that people just couldn't believe what was happening, right? And I think we're in a similar situation now, where our mainstream media is completely controlled, both the left and the right, and they sort of go at each other in what I would call a pseudo battle from time to time, but they're all pro-establishment, and people just can't believe that the media would be controlled in this way. But I've talked about intelligence infiltration in the media and some of the documents that are available on that, and I'm not going to break it all down here. But that's one of the things that we're dealing with. It's one of my personal frustrations. I don't know. You can sort of read that on their own, come to their own conclusions about what I'm trying to say here. I think what I realize is that I'm reaching sort of a crossroads in my activism. I've been doing this now for 2 going on 3 years, and I'm hitting a wall right now. Right now, the blanket of censorship that's been put over top of me is almost absolute, to the point now that I'm down to talking to 7 people on YouTube. So, there'll be a lot of people who view this in replay, if you will, later on, but right now only 7. So I'm kind of at a crossroads. So now that I can't advertise in papers, I can't rent public venues in major cities, Twitter's killed my account, Facebook has all but killed my account, I'm losing my ability to communicate. So what do I do? Like, how do I continue to pursue the agenda that means so much to me, right? I want to try to save these vulnerable kids, these foster kids who are like younger versions of myself in many cases, I'm sure. And all of these kids with autism and some of the other psychological and emotional issues that are so prevalent with these kids who are identifying as transgender. So how do I sort of continue to try to push this into the public eye when the media won't look at me at all unless there's some big fuss, and then they'll only look at me to defame me. But when there's no fuss being made, they just ignore me completely. So how do I, without the ability to advertise or communicate, how do I continue to push this initiative that's so important to me? It's a problem, right? It's a problem. I don't know really what to do about that. I mean, I've got some ideas forming in my head. I don't know if anybody ever saw the movie Time Bandits. I think it's Terry Gilliam did it, from Monty Python. There's one of the characters in there goes into a trance and says, "I've got an idea forming in my head." It's kind of me. I've got an idea forming in my head too. So how do you thrust this into the public eye? If anybody's got any ideas about how I can thrust this into the public eye, I'm all ears. My own ideas are problematic. We'll leave it at that. Problematic. I'm not going to let it go. That's what they want me to do. They want to throw this blanket of censorship over top of me and just smother me out of existence and smother my issue out of existence and hope it goes away. And if they ever address it, they want to address it on their terms, which undoubtedly will be this: okay, we won't allow them to transition kids under the age of 12, right? And then it'll just keep on transitioning the majority of the youths who are identifying as transgender. But in the meantime, they want to just sort of smother me out of existence. It's interesting because, of course, I was all over the media with the UBC fiasco and the Pride Parade. So there's a lot of people who are aware of who I am. But I have no voice right now, right? Now I'm whatever the media says I am. And I need to, like, I've hit a wall. Okay, so I've hit a wall. I've got 5 viewers right now. I've hit a wall. How do I, right at the critical juncture, right at this critical juncture where I'm calling for a provincial inquiry and a national inquiry, and I've got all of this evidence to support it, and I've got evidence that supports my claims that the pharmaceutical industry has conflicts of interest with some of the people setting the policies and stuff like that. I've got all this evidence that I'm just, itching and willing to make part of an inquiry, and this is when this complete blanket goes down upon me, and I can't communicate. So it's troublesome. Okay, so this is the problem here. Okay, so contact Fox News. So this gets back to my thesis, which is that the media is controlled. And by the media, I mean the left and the right media. They're under control. Okay, Fox News has been alerted. Okay, Tucker Carlson has been alerted. All kinds of figures in the right media have been alerted, have received my video, received snippets of my evidence, and they don't cover it, okay? Because I am going against, okay, so you've got two things, okay? So you've got the prevailing narrative, and then you've got a fallback narrative. The prevailing narrative is on what you might call the left. The fallback narrative is on the right. But both of these narratives are establishment narratives, okay? Fox is on the fallback establishment narrative, okay, which does not include aggressively going after pharmaceutical companies and does not include stopping the transitioning of teenagers, okay? My narrative goes after the pharmaceutical companies and goes after the transitioning of teenagers and stuff, and they can't have that, so they're not going to cover me. And this is why post-millennial disappeared me, put me down the memory hole, right? Can't have that. Megan Murphy, who claims to be somebody who's a champion on our side and who has a significant voice with her Feminist Current. If you go to the Feminist Current website and do an exact search for Jen Smith, you will get a grand total of 0 hits. 0. Do the same thing for Soji123. 0 hits, right? So Megan Murphy stays in that same narrow window, and so she's all over the newspapers and stuff as badly or bravely battling censorship. She's not even spoken of in a negative light for the most part. So she gets a wide audience because she stays in that establishment narrative. I don't. So I've got a real problem. Fox certainly won't hear my narrative. I got one brief mention by Ben Shapiro's Daily Wire. That's about the only mention I got in the intellectual dark web, right? The right media. That had to do with the UBC incident where Antifa was in the building and took a swing at somebody after pulling the fire alarm. That got brief play on Daily Wire, but that's it. Okay, so let's go back to this again. Most people I see talking Fox seem to be against children transitioning. Almost without exception. Almost without exception. Almost every talking head I've seen on what we'll call right media are people who define children as under the age of 12. Right? So they can sit there. It's like Ken Zucker, right? So I was saying earlier with Ken Zucker, let's just bring that back up. Ken Zucker, the brave champion. I believe Zucker has been on Fox. The brave champion of ending child transitioning. But the problem is, right there on the left. By the age of 11, it's not showing the whole thing here. Let's go. There we go. Okay, so by the age of 11 or 12, trans kids are typically locked into their gender identity. For them, I very much support that pathway, and that pathway would be medical transition. Okay, so he's an example of one of these heroes who is opposed to children transitioning, but he's got a very specific definition of children, right, under the age of 12. So whenever you've got someone on Fox or anywhere else who's talking about child transitioning, you need to get them to define what they mean by child. Okay, because frequently, especially if they're in the medical profession, they're going to use a clinical definition. Okay, so over the age of 11 is going to be an adolescent, right? So Ken Zucker is 100% behind adolescent transition, and he's opposed to child. Oh, well, he encourages what they call watchful waiting for children, which is under the age of 12. So that's the problem. There's the official narrative and the fallback narrative. Okay, the fallback narrative, for the most part, doesn't include stopping the transitioning of teenagers. Right? They're not considered children. And so many of the people who are emerging as champions of common sense, like Camille Paglia, is pro-pedophilia. Why are they? And you can see that in that screen there too. Not in that screen, but Paglia has come out recently and has been all over the media for calling child transitioning a crime against humanity. Well, that's great, but we need to go further, right? So in her quote there, she again is talking age 3 or 10. They don't know their identity at that age, right? She won't go into the teens, okay? Because Camille Paglia has a long history of being pro-pedophilia, so she doesn't regard teenagers as children, okay? And that is the narrative that we're battling there. And I'm trying to be somebody who says, no, look, anybody under the age of 18 should not be getting medically transitioned, right? But they don't want that voice out there. So that's going to continue to be my problem. So Paul asks, when would you say it is okay? After 18? Okay, so you need to understand that the long-term effects of taking Lupron during puberty are not fully understood. We know that Lupron has serious potential side effects in terms of bone density, causing brittle bones and this type of thing. When taken in conjunction with these cross-sex hormones can cause permanent sterility as well. It's highly toxic. So a lot of the effects are not even going to be known. There's all kinds of lawsuits regarding Lupron right now, but they continue to sell it. So why do you want to give this drug to kids? Highly toxic, right? The cross-sex hormones are known to sterilize. So if you go to the University of California, San Francisco's Transgender Care Clinic's webpage, which is probably the preeminent transgender care facility in the world, that has as one of their main people Stephen Rosenthal, who is the official spokesman for the Endocrine Society, who makes the guidelines for how to treat transgender people and use. He works there. But if you go to their website and look at estrogen, there's an information page on estrogen therapy for boys who are transgender. And right on that page there, it says you must assume that you will within, I think it's said 2 months, within 2 months of beginning estrogen therapy, you must assume that you will become permanently and irreversibly sterile. Okay, that's according to a pro transition clinic, right? So why do you want to be giving these things to kids at all? And, when should they do it? Okay, so the prefrontal cortex in the brain is not even developed fully until you're 25. Looking back on my own life, I can say that before 25, I didn't have a good, especially for kids with psychological and emotional problems like me. You take kids in foster care who are transitioning at such high rates right now. I was a kid in foster care, and I was like, by the time I got out of high school, I was messed up. Okay, it took me a long time to sort of understand what had happened to me in terms of my psychology, right? I didn't sort of get a clear understanding of that, I would say, until I was into my 30s. So when's it going to be okay? I would say very, 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 very minimum 18. Okay, very minimum. A number that's been discussed more often. I mean, because the brain isn't fully developed until 25, you could argue 25. Sort of a compromise that I've discussed with other people seems to be around the age of 21. But that, I understand, is difficult too. Once you're sort of the age of the majority and are your own master, then it's hard to say that they shouldn't be able to. So, but under the age of the majority, we can restrict them. We restrict them from drinking. We restrict their driving privileges. We restrict who they can have sex with in terms of 13-year-old having sex with a 40-year-old. We have restrictions, and they're there for good reasons. And I would say the same restrictions should apply to this whole transitioning thing. But then again, we get into this question of, okay, what do you mean by transitioning? Okay, because there's two things. Transitioning comes in two parts. There's social transitioning and there's medical transitioning. Okay, but it's difficult. Okay, so medical transitioning, I'm pretty clear. No medical transitioning until you're the age of the majority. Okay, until you're in a better sort of psychological state to be able to understand the long-term consequences, such as the fact that you're not going to be able to have kids possibly, right, ever. So medical transition's sort of a no-brainer. The social transitioning is difficult, okay, because social transitioning puts you on that path towards medical transitioning. Okay, so there's a whole psychological game that happens there. So I get this all the time from people saying, well, maybe we should just let these kids socially transition. So if you got a young boy who thinks that he's a girl, well, let him start just dressing up as a girl and acting like a girl and behaving as a girl and all of these things. And, what's the harm in that, they say. The harm in that is the psychology that's involved. Okay, so you take a young boy, and I've talked about this in my video I did with Freedom Free for All, calling for an inquiry. You take a young boy, okay, and you put him in the role of a young girl. No matter what anybody says, okay, he is immediately going to be besieged by enormous social and psychological pressures to look the part. Some externally, some internally within the child himself. Okay, immediate pressures to look that part, but he's got his biology working against him. So how does he get around that? Okay, and that's why we see them so often going on to these drugs and stuff. Okay, so by encouraging him to transition, you are by extension encouraging him to medically transition too. Okay, so right now it's almost a fait accompli, right? So allow him to socially transition and go on, and we see this in the studies too. So backtrack a bit here. So if we look at some of the studies that have been done previously, looking at kids with gender dysphoria, think that they're the opposite sex or whatever. In the past, they found that between 60 and 85% of kids, if you just leave them alone and don't nurture that idea or facilitate that idea of changing gender, 65 to 85% of the time, they will just desist. They'll grow out of it and they'll go on with the gender that corresponds with their biological sex, right? But there are other studies that show that if you reinforce that cross-gender expression, as opposed to not reinforcing it, the moment you reinforce it, the majority will go on to continue to transition. Okay, so that's the problem there. And the problem is that because Lupron and synthetic hormones and all this stuff are available to these kids, and all of these kids know about it, right? You can't go onto the web and have a discussion with a fellow teen about transing without the issue of hormones and stuff coming up. Okay, so everybody is aware of that in the trans community, starting at a very young age. So when you encourage the kid to socially transition, you're putting him in that role where all of these pressures are upon him to look the part. So he's going to look towards these drugs and stuff, which right now the establishment is making easy or reasonably easy for him to get access to if he knows all the right things to say and all the right things to do. So there is a question as to whether or not you want to play that game. Now, if we made the drugs and stuff illegal until they're an adult, you say, okay, well, that kind of addresses it. However, there's still going to be a black market for it out there. So it's a really tricky situation. I mean, obviously, expressing in a cross-gender way is not something I have a big problem with. It's just that our kids sort of equipped to handle the pressure. I mean, I have pressures associated with this at my age, right? So I'm sort of glammed out in skirt and stuff, and I go into the men's room, for instance, on the ferry or something, right? And people will look at me funny and stuff. So there's still pressures that come upon you. Like even if I'm not going to a sort of a high stress location like a washroom, just if I'm like walking around and stuff, sometimes I'll get funny looks because I haven't taken all the hormones and stuff like that, right? So there are still social pressures out there. So it's a really difficult situation. Why not InfoWars? Okay, so Alex Jones and company. Well, Alex Jones, just for the record, I believe is probably, well, I'm not going to go there. Just say that I don't trust Alex Jones. I haven't heard him really talk about pharmaceutical companies. The problem with Alex Jones is he tends to lump all of these things together. Okay, so he'll talk about things that make sense and then bring in Pizzagate or something, and link Pizzagate to the transgender issue, or chemtrails, or something else. You'll lump all these things together. That's an old strategy, right? So I haven't tried actually to contact Alex Jones about this. I have a strong suspicion he probably wouldn't. He probably wouldn't entertain it anyway, because it's worth a try. Did I ever have body dysmorphia? I would say this is, I think there is a lot of bad science in transgender research out there, and one of it benefits big pharma, so that's why it's bad. So I believe that transgender identity is actually a form of transgender communication. Okay, so it's just you using forms of dress and stuff like that to communicate some sort of internal feelings, an internal psychology that you have. I had a period where I thought that it might be great if I was a woman, but I never detached from reality in that way. I never had, like, I've body dysmorphia. I mean, you have to sort of define that. Are you talking about genital dysphoria? Because I've never had any problem with my body per se. I have self-image. I've always had self-image problems. I had terrible self-image problems when I was a child. Like, I can't look back into my mind as a child without being horrified about my own image of myself. But it had nothing to do with the fact that I had, male genitals and stuff like that. My manifestations when I was young, in terms of transgender expression, came out of my desire to be something else, right? Because I didn't like myself. I wanted to be something else. And I had this super pretty foster sister that I could sort of emulate and envision myself as. And I became sort of obsessed on that. And I would argue that the majority of cases of child transgender identity are obsessions. Okay. Very, very, very few cases of classic body dysphoria. It's very rare. So I wouldn't say that I'm rare. I actually believe that I am not rare in the sense of how it manifests in the mind, but rare in the sense that I'm sort of honest about sort of the obsessional nature of it. Yeah, I don't follow Alex Jones, so I don't know what he's been covering. Certainly, he's got a big platform, but I don't think he would cover me. But maybe. Yeah, genital dysphoria. It's very rare. Okay, very rare. And you'll know that it's rare because of the genital reassignment surgery rates. Okay, so 98 point, what is it? I can't remember. I think it's 98.6% of all transgender identified males have not had genital reassignment surgery. Okay, so it's a very high percentage who keep their bodies intact. Okay, very small percentage who go through with the genital reassignment surgery. So that supports my thesis that my state of mind is the norm. Okay, body dysphoria. Okay, so I believe in most cases what you're dealing with is a desire or an obsession to be the opposite sex, and there'll be different reasons why people develop this sort of obsession and desire to be the opposite sex. It's a long discussion, but it's psychological, and the proof that it's psychological can be found in numerous places in terms of previous science. So the 65% to 85% of kids desist, right? So that shows you that it's psychological. There's a lot of people who want to argue this sort of born that way thing, and I just don't subscribe to the born that way. There's no evidence. There's no, there's interesting studies and stuff, but there's no proof of anybody being born that way. There's no test or anything that can be taken. So how do you handle it if you don't nurture it? What sort of dialogue would you have while allowing them to figure it out without pushing them one way or the other? Well, I mean, first of all, we need to roll the clock back. Let's roll the clock back to, say, 40 or 50 years ago. Okay, this whole thing wasn't around at that time. Okay, when I was a kid, about 9 or 10 years old, experimenting with that, I was an anomaly, right? Very rare thing. Now it's like all over the place. Okay, so if we roll back the clock, we'll find that if you just leave things and discourage it, which is exactly what happened in most cases when I was a kid, they just sort of grew through it as a child, and then as an adult, well, you'll do what you do. So as an adult, I kept on sort of playing with it and stuff, but I didn't go into all of these drugs and stuff that permanently destroy your body. And that's a serious issue. Especially the cross-sex hormones affect your, as a male, affect your sexual functionality. And this has been written about by many transgender people in terms of trying to deal with the assault on your sexual function. So, how do you deal with it? How did we deal with it in the past? We dealt with it by discouraging it, right? Now it's like people have got everybody thinking that it's a crime that if you got a boy who says I'm a girl, to say, no, you're not a girl, you're a boy. Okay, that's what was always done before, and the kids all survived just fine, and I've got the forensic stats to back this up, right? Now they've got everybody believing that if you don't reinforce or nurture that idea in these kids, well, they're going to immediately go out and kill themselves or something, right? And that's because they got all these bogus self-report studies about suicidal ideation, even though the forensic data doesn't back up all of these frightening claims. So I actually believe, so I was discouraged when I was a kid, and I actually believe that was the right thing to do because it kept me tethered to physical reality, right? And it's not some sort of crime against humanity to say, okay, you're a boy, sort of stay in your lane as a boy. And, if you want to experiment with, living as the opposite gender when you get to be an adult, okay, whatever, as long as you're not, actually forcing other people to pretend that you somehow magically change sex, because that starts trampling on the rights of others. Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult thing because it's so saturated in propaganda right now. People can ask me whatever questions they like. The stat about genital reassignment surgery is, okay, now Paul says, I didn't know that stat. We're talking about 98, I think it was 98.2% actually, transgender identified males have not had genital reassignment surgery. Some of them will say, I've had surgery, but they won't break that down because many people, when they say they've had surgery, it means they've had top surgery. So basically they've gotten fake boobs to look more the part, right? But 98.2 or 98.6% of them have not had genital reassignment surgery. Now, I want you to keep this in mind because whenever you see, like everywhere I've looked, okay, so whether it was the debate around C16 in Canada or some of the debates in the United States around transgender laws and stuff, everywhere I've looked, this stat, which I know the experts are aware of, is never brought up. Okay, so in all the discussions of C-16, they never brought this when they're talking about allowing or laws that are going to allow men into women's private spaces and into rape shelters and into women's prisons and stuff like that. When they're discussing this and the laws that will facilitate this, and this is exactly what we're seeing happen right now, in that discussion, they never brought up the statistic. That is a deliberate form of mass deception against the people. Okay, so that is a sign of a deliberately dishonest government manipulating people. The fact that more people don't know that stat is an outrage, and this is one of these stats that get me banned and silenced all the time. Okay, so Fox News doesn't want me releasing this stat any more than anybody else. Have you ever heard Fox News releasing this stat? No, you haven't, because that's outside the approved oppositional narrative. So you're asking about Barrett. Barrett's lease is up at the end of November, I believe. It's not being shut down per se. The property is owned by developers, I believe, and the lease was designed to end at the end of November, and I think they're going to tear it down or something and build something new. So I don't think discouraging it is detrimental. It wasn't detrimental to me. Okay, so when I was told, so I had sort of a conservative World War II veteran foster father when I began experimenting with this as a child. And he basically took me aside and he said, this is unacceptable behavior. Okay, don't do this anymore, right? And what was my reaction to that? My reaction to that was, okay, I'm not supposed to do this anymore because for some reason it's wrong. I mean, much of our morals that we construct as a society are internal constructions, and there's no sort of physical way of validating their integrity. It's all constructs. And so when he told me that it was unacceptable for me to dress that way, I just sort of took his word for it that this wasn't acceptable. So I kept on playing with it in secret and stuff because that's what confused, rebellious kids will do. But I was traumatized by him saying that I couldn't do it. So no, I don't believe that. I mean, kids, you have to tell kids no to all kinds. A kid wants to have a shot of whiskey before going to school. The appropriate thing to do is say no. So it's just, okay, you have to say no to kids sometimes. And so you have to sort of talk about when is it appropriate to do so and when not. So we've got to roll back. Okay, so you say that your intuition told you that you could discourage it, but how did we get to that state? Okay, because we had the two sort of opposing scientific tidbits that I gave you there earlier, which is that if you either don't encourage or discourage kids from identifying as transgender, in 65 to 85% of cases, they will desist without harm. Okay, and they'll just grow through it and away they go. 65 to 85%. There's a small percentage who will stick with it. Now, the ones who stuck with it, they may not have been discouraged. They may have just been left alone. Okay, maybe if you discourage them, that desistance rate would be even higher. Okay, but then you've got this other study that shows that if you, alternatively, if you reinforce that cross-gender expression, and you facilitate that expression, in the majority of cases, they will stay transgender. Okay, so it's a matter of how you as a parent or a guardian respond to them and treat them that's going to make the decision there. Okay, so the thing is that say you're a big pharmaceutical company who wants to sell billions of dollars worth of drugs and stuff, transitioning kids. How do you break this conflict here? How do you get people to ignore this? Because this is what happens is that parents will go, okay, so if you don't reinforce them, they'll probably just grow out of it. Okay, so that's what I want to do with my kid because I don't want them taking say, the cross-sex hormones that have been permanently sterilized, then that seems like an extreme action, so I don't want to encourage that. So let's just not encourage the behavior at all. How do you get them to surrender that and go with this other thing where you reinforce them and they keep on staying transgender? How do you break people out of that tie? Well, we saw this, or I saw this recently with a pro-SOGI public speaker who speaks on Vancouver Island, this twit. I call her a twit because of some of the crazy stuff that she says. But she says that she encounters in her public talks parents who say exactly that we feel that, if our kid wants to be transgender when they're an adult, that's fine. But right now, as a kid, we don't want them really messing with that. We feel we'll just let them sort of grow through it. And if they want to do it when they're an adult, fine. And she said that her response to these parents is to say, well, how do you know that your child's going to live to be an adult? And by that, she's pulling out this blackmail card, this suicide blackmail card, okay? Emotional blackmail, okay? That's how they break the tie, okay? So what they've done is they've gone to everybody and they've said that if you don't reinforce their behavior, they're going to kill themselves. So that was Jazz Jennings' mother's comment. She said that I'd rather have a living daughter than a dead son, okay? So it's that same sort of emotional blackmail card, but there's no forensic data to support that. What they have come up with is a whole bunch of self-report studies that show that allegedly transgender people are the most suicidal people on the planet. Okay, more suicidal, in fact, than psychotic schizophrenics. We used to always be thought of as sort of the highest suicide rate group. At suicide rates around 40%, I believe it was. But they've got all these self-reports, okay? But any sort of good scientist knows that self-reports are interesting, and you should listen to self-reports. And in terms of psychological counseling and stuff, you want to listen to what people say and treat them seriously when they say things. However, when you're looking at extreme solutions, which is what they're recommending in the case of these transgender kids, self-reports have to be contrasted against forensic data, okay? And that's hard evidence, okay? So we've got all of these transgender people saying they're going to commit suicide, okay? But is there any evidence that they actually will? Because the suicide card has been used by, and this is a well-known psychological phenomenon, it's been used by kids since time immemorial as a sort of a blackmail card against their parents. They want to be able to go to the party, or they want to be able to date so-and-so, or they want to be able to get a new car or whatever. If you don't do it, then I'll kill myself. It's an old sort of emotional blackmail card that's been used in relationships, in interfamily relationships. It's also used in abusive relationships. So, a guy is beating his wife or something, and the wife wants to leave. Frequently, the guy will say, if you leave me, I'll kill myself, right? It's an emotional blackmail card. But the thing is that it's easy to make claims like that. It's easy to use that card as a blackmail tool to get what you want. But again, when you're using that accusation to make extreme decisions, you have to contrast the self-reports against forensic data where that data is available. Okay, so very recently there was a study done in the Journal of Pediatrics in the US, which came out with this claim that transgender kids were anywhere from 45 to 52%. It was 45 to 52% had allegedly attempted suicide. So basically 1 in 2 transgender kids not only thought about suicide, had actually attempted to commit suicide. That is like a startling number. There's no other condition with that kind of numbers, okay? That number should make people suspicious, okay? And I'll get into why that number should make people suspicious. But again, self-reports, if you have forensic data, you need to contrast them, okay? And none of these reports, like the study in the Journal of Pediatrics, it did not look at forensic data, okay? None of these reports that come out about transgender suicidal inclinations look at forensic data. And the reason they don't is because the stats don't back them up. Okay, so the theory is that you have to reinforce not only transgender, but LGBT identity has to be actively reinforced, or they'll become emotionally distraught and be more likely to kill themselves, right? But the more society has become tolerant of LGBTQ issues, that has not manifested in forensic data. Okay, so actually, as we go back in time into the 1970s and the 1960s, what we find is that teenager and youth suicide actually goes down from what it is today when toleration is high. Now, these are inconvenient facts that go against the self-reports. So these studies never report that fact. They just push it out of the way completely and go back to all of these self-reports. Now, why would they do that? Okay, well, a lot of these people have connections to Big Pharma. Okay, but more than that. So I know that this is well known in the transgender community, that the suicide card is a way of getting what you want. And not just me. So Dr. Wallace Wong, a preeminent gender psychologist here in British Columbia, in a recent talk was talking about this very fact, and that, you know, it might be hard to get the treatments that you want paid for. It might be hard to get the drugs and stuff that you want. But if you really, really want them, the best way to do that is suicide. And in his words, to pull a stunt, right? Because every time that will get you everything that you want. And this is well known in the transgender community, okay? And that's why forensic stats have to be brought into it, okay? This is a psychological blackmail game, in my opinion. There are instances of suicide, but they're what psychology calls vivid examples, okay? So suicide rates, we don't have actual suicide rates for transgender identified people specifically. We have just rates of suicide for children and adolescents, okay? But in both cases, the forensic data does not support the idea that reinforcing this reduces suicide. It's just not there. But they need to keep that out of the equation because they're spinning a narrative. How's that for a lengthy answer? Well, what is the right thing? The right thing, okay, so my thing is, what is the right thing? Whatever your identity is, however you express yourself in the world, it has to first and foremost be tethered to knowable, testable, physical reality. If you untether yourself from that, you're on the wrong path. Okay, you're running adrift, and you're probably you're putting yourself at enormous risk. Anytime you untether, whether it's your policies as a government or your policies as a parent, if you untether it from knowable, testable physical reality, I think you're going to get into trouble. Okay, if you tell a kid that they can't have something that they want, or they can't do something that they want, they're not going to like it, and they're going to be distraught about it. That's just part of being a kid. Okay. Almost everybody when they were a kid were told that there were certain things they couldn't do, and certain things that they wanted they couldn't have. Okay, so if you go to a kid who says, okay, let's say a young boy, and says, I'm a girl, and you say, well, no, you're not a girl, and I'm not going to let you, manifest in the world as a girl, he may be upset about that, and he might even cry if he's young enough, right? But that's like, you don't judge your decision based on his reaction to it, right? Particularly when your decision or your policy is being tethered to physical reality, okay? If they're asking you to allow something that untethers from physical reality, that's a bad idea. Okay, so how often do you cross-dress? Okay, so when I was young, the term cross-dresser was specifically used as a term of derision for people with a sexual fetish, typically somebody like O. J. Edgar Hoover. who did it only at home, only in his bedroom, and primarily for sexual purposes. Okay, so I don't like the term cross-dresser because it's a term of derision. Transvestite kind of got thrown into that same category. So how often do I cross-dress? What do you mean by cross-dress? I have, I'm manifesting the world in all kinds of different ways. Unlike a lot of these people who attack me and say that, well, you're not transgender because, whatever reason they come up with, I have done what I would call the full transgender experience because I've actually had sexual relations with men. And Morgane Auger has given me quite definite evidence that Morgane Auger has never done this and yet claims to be transgender. I could argue that Morgane Auger is not transgender because Morgane Auger has never had intimate relations with a man, right? Now, whether you're a man or whether you're a woman has nothing to do with how you dress, okay? I know lots of women who wear manly clothes all the time, right? And never wear makeup, right? So what you wear is not an indication of what you are, okay? How often do I? Well, I've always got long hair. I always wear long dangly earrings, right? I dress differently at work than I do, say, on weekends or whatever, because I have a menial job, and it'd be stupid for me to go wearing my sparkly shirts or whatever to work, right? And because I tend to sweat on my job, I won't wear makeup either because I would have raccoon eyes and stuff by the end of my shift, and that would be kind of stupid too. But does the makeup and does the shirt decide what I am? Okay, how often do I mean, my fashions that you see me manifesting here are a regular thing for me. Okay, when I go out and stuff, I get dressed up in fancy bling and stuff. It's just part of who I am. Okay, and I used to be part of how I manifested in the world in terms of dating and stuff like that too. I've talked about some of this history too. And I don't really want to get into the whole psychology of that. But how you dress is it depends on who you're talking to and what day you're talking to them on and what argument they're trying to spin. But on the other side of this argument, they'll either say that how you dress has nothing to do with it, or if they're dealing with somebody like me, they'll say it does have something to do with it. So you don't wear a dress to work, so that means that you're not transgender. To which I respond, no, I don't wear a dress to work, which means I have common sense, because it'd be stupid for me to wear a dress to my job, right? And even then, it's like, again, some women never wear dresses, right? And I own dresses, but I seldom wear dresses. I wear skirts fairly regularly. I've got some awesome skirts that I've actually modified myself with studs and crystals and stuff. And I will wear those from time to time. But the rest of the time I'll wear jeans, like I'm wearing jeans right now. Okay, but you can see there that I've got, I've got my bling. I've always got something blingy on there. It's a bling belt that goes with my jeans. Sometimes I'll do the makeup thing. Sometimes I won't. I like to do a little foundation to even my skin tone. I do like to do eyeliner and stuff. I don't always wear eyeshadow. I found too much makeup on my eyes will irritate my eyes, so I don't wear makeup all the time. I try to give my skin a break because it can be very hard on my skin anyway. Some people can tolerate it all the time. I can't. But I mean, it's a pointless discussion, right? It's a pointless discussion. It's like judging whether somebody's a woman or not by how often they wear dresses. Dress as a woman. Okay, so there you go, Paul. So I could bring in an army of feminists to immediately launch upon you and rip you to shreds for saying dress as a woman. Okay, a woman is not something you dress as. A woman is something you are or are not. Okay, how you dress is immaterial. Okay, in our society, there are certain clothes that are associated with women, like like skirts and high heels and stuff like that. Okay, but not all women wear those things, right? I wear those things regularly, like this top. Okay, so I'm out and about today wearing this top, which comes from the women's section. Okay, it's just part of who I am and how I express in the world. But I mean, you can sort of hack and slash all kinds of parts of my identity, trying to make sense of it all. But ultimately, transgender is a form of behavior and a form of expression. Okay, and people feel different ways on different days in different moods, and just trying to reduce it to dress is not going to lead anywhere. Okay, certainly how you dress. So here's what I would say. I would say that if somebody in my position, if they went out of their way to wear makeup and girly dresses and stuff to do my job, they would be the one who's a fraud, not me. Okay, because I don't need to do that to sort of reinforce my behavior when I go to work. When I go to work, I need to dress practically for my job. Okay, and that means wearing clothes suitable for the job. And like I say, I don't even see anybody on my job except for one person. And I don't really care what he thinks of me. So why do I need to get all glammed out for that, right? Like I say, I've always got long earrings and some bling and stuff on because that's just part of who I am. But too many transgender people, in my mind, go to absurd lengths to convince the world that they're something that they're not, which is the opposite sex. Okay, rather than just sort of expressing and letting it go. Okay, and accepting who they are, what they are, and dressing as they want, and dressing, preferably in some cases, is for the sake of employers in a practical way. Anyway, it's a long discussion. Thought I'd come on and give YouTube a try since I can't communicate on any other channel. Thanks for everybody who watched, and chat with you all in the future, I hope, unless they ban my YouTube channel too.